In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Tonight is class 15 of our Orthodox survival course. We've begun the period of the Renaissance. And before I go on with our notes tonight, I have a couple of things to correct from last week's class, where we made last week was a transition class from the High Middle Ages to the Renaissance. I went through some key ideas, and I noticed in the recording, and looking at my notes, I made a couple of mistakes. And one I made spontaneously in our discussion, and therefore it's recorded on the audio, but it's not in the notes. And at one point we were discussing the theophanies of God in the Old Testament, and I was listing some of them off the top of my head. And out of carelessness, I included the miracle at the dividing of the Red Sea. I said the burning bush and God speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, and then I said the Red Sea, but of course the Red Sea is not a theophany in the sense of the burning bush, or God speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai is a theophany. The parting of the Red Sea was actually a great created effect. It was a great physical miracle, right, where the water was parted and the people went through, and then the waters drowned Pharaoh and his soldiers. So it's a theophany in the sense that all of God's creations manifest or reveal something about God, but not in the sense of a direct perception of the divine energies by a saint who is in a state of theosis. Everybody saw the dividing of the Red Sea. Saints, sinners, the Hebrews, the Egyptians, the animals, everyone saw it. Okay, but these specific theophanies where God reveals himself directly to a saint or in a different category. We include in this the burning bush. Okay, or God speaking directly to the saints. Or when God in paradise, where God spoke directly to Adam and Eve. You see, this is quite different. The other mistake was not accidental. It was not due to just my rattling, just talking. Okay, but it was due to a lack of a very important distinction in the notes. Now, some of you weren't here last week, so I'm going to have to go over this again to make clear what my mistake was. Okay, in the section on nominalism last week, we discussed the true answer to the problem of the universals. So I'm going to go back and look for everybody, for our listeners listening on the podcast as well as for us here present. I'm going to go back to our notes on 14 and go through this problem of the universal. What is the problem of the universals? This is a very important, it was and remains a very important philosophical question. Okay, a universal, if we look at our notes in chapter 14, the second to last page, notes in chapter 14, look halfway down. What is this problem of the universals? A universal is anything predicated of more than one individual. Okay. Man, for example, is predicated of Peter and Paul. We look at Peter and Paul and we say of both of them, each is a man, or both are men. Okay. The philosophical problem is this. Does the word man signify something that really exists? Or is it just a notion, a tag we apply to the two individuals pragmatically for convenience's sake? Is there such a thing as human nature? Or is it just a notion, a linguistic convention we can change at will? Do you see how this applies directly to things that are being done today, being said today? Or if they're claiming there's no such thing as human nature, you can identify with whatever you want to be. You see? Well, this mistake goes all the way back to this philosophical error of nominalism. Okay. So is there such a thing as human nature? There are three possible answers. One is nominalism. Nominalism is the idea that the universals are just names, nomina, that's where it came from. Nominalism means nameism. The universals are just names that we give to individual substances that seem to be kind of the same. So in the view of the nominalists, there's no such thing out there as human nature. There's no human nature, there's no horse nature, no house nature, no star nature. There's no humanness. They're just individuals that we just give the tag human to because those things look kind of alike and we have to group them together. For convenience sake. Now, the opposite of nominalism is extreme realism, which is the position of Plato. The nominalists of Plato's time were his enemies, the sophists, who didn't care about truth. They were just using language to make money, right, to be powerful. That's why they hated Socrates for pointing out their hypocrisy and their venality, why they had him framed and executed. Okay. So Plato hated this idea. Plato says, no, we really can perceive natures of things. We really can know the nature of something. Because he saw this idea leads to skepticism. Okay, and of course Plato's, he's in his dialogues, he's using the he's speaking through Socrates. We don't know exactly what Socrates said and what's Plato's version of what Socrates said, right? But Plato is the one who wrote the dialogues, and especially the Republic, where his theory of knowledge is clearly explained. So Plato combats this idea, which obviously leads to skepticism, cynicism, the use of power, which he associates with Socrates' opponents, the sophists, with so Plato says a radically opposite idea. The universals are so real, they have a separate existence in the world of the forms, ta'ide in Greek, or ta'ede. There's a world of the forms, that's the real world, and this world is a delusory world, a world of shadows, where things aren't quite real. They're just sort of real. They're real insofar as they partake of the real forms in the world of the forms. So when we perceive humanness, our mind is experiencing anamnesis, which means remembering again of that true world in which our souls pre-existed. And this is Plato, not Christianity. Also, this became a heresy of Origen, the pre-existence of souls. It's one of the reasons Origen is a heretic. Okay, Origen is condemned as a heretic. So our souls pre-existed in the world of the forms. Through some cosmic accident or tragedy, they were imprisoned in flesh in this world, in this delusory world. But when the soul goes back to the world of the forms, it goes back to the real world, right? So there's a soteriological problem here. Soteriology means that relating to salvation. Okay. If this is true, then when you leave the body and re-enter that world of the forms, how does your humanness encounter humanness with a capital H and not just get absorbed by it? That's the real humanness, right? You're just a shadow of that. Your humanness is just a shadow of that. So this way of looking at what salvation is not much different from the way Hindus think about it, right? That you go through all these reincarnations, because Plato believed in this. Plato believed in the transmigration of souls, that the body was just disposable, right? And then you went back, in Plato's idea, you go back to the world of the forms. Of course, in the Hindu idea, you go back, you're absorbed into the world spirit, or the ultimate oneness. The Neoplatonists, like Plotinus, would call it the monad, the ultimate unity. Okay? That's just absorption, right? The truth and the position of the Church is moderate realism, which in its original form is a solution of Aristotle, but in a modified and actually more exalted form is taught by the Holy Fathers. Okay? The universals do exist, but they exist only as instantiated in individual instances. Okay, when I see humanness in you and I see humanness in you, I'm seeing something real that's in both of you that you share. In all of us, it makes us human. Our human nature is real. God created it. It's a real thing that we all share, but it's not out there somewhere. You can't go around the corner and find a box with human nature in it. Right? It's in us. Okay? Humanness does exist, but we see it only in examples like Peter and Paul. But the question is, how does the mind know how to do this? How does the mind know how to look at things at the same time and say, they share a nature in common? The answer is very beautiful and very satisfying. Okay? Our minds are made according to the image of the Logos, the primordial word of the primordial mind, in which, in the Logos, according to his energies, are found the Logi, that's plural of Logos, right, the Logoses. The archetypes are patterns of all created things. So there's the Logos, the second person of the Holy Trinity, the Son of God, who in the flesh is our Lord Jesus Christ. And he's the pattern for all reality, right? And contained in him, according to his energies, not according to his essence, according to his energies, contained in him are the little Logoses, the Logi, the principles of all created things. Okay? Our minds are made according to the pattern, according to the image of his mind. So we can perceive the universals, we can perceive the created natures that are made according to these Logi that are in the mind of God. Okay? And furthermore, when a Christian attains theoria, that's the second stage of spiritual life, in which the passions are healed and the mind starts perceiving reality accurately, a very holy person. Okay? He starts to perceive the Logi of all things, as well as their universals. Right? As well as the created natures. So the true scientists are very holy people who don't need experimentation, they don't need all these analysis, they just intuitively perceive the reality of things. That's why the animals and the plants and all nature bow to the saints, then communicate directly with them because they understand them at a level. It's not just an intuitive understanding. There are, of course, people who live close to the land, peasants, farmers, who have an intuitive understanding of plants and animals and so forth. But the saints have actually a spiritual understanding. So we, all of us, all human beings, Christians or non-Christians, holy or not holy, perceive the universals because we're made according to the image. We're all made according to the image of God. But a saint actually doesn't only see the universals, the created natures. The saint perceives the logi, or the uncreated principles that are contained in the logos according to his energies. Okay. Now, the mistake I made last week in my notes was that I didn't make this distinction. I didn't make it clear that the universals are created and the logi are separate or different from the universals. Okay? The universals are the created natures. They really exist, but they're only exist as instantiated in instances, each instance, individual instances. The logi are the divine patterns that are the blueprint, so to speak, for the natures. Now the scholastics, with their beloved absolute divine simplicity, where they say there's no distinction in God between the essence and the energies. God is pure act. They don't, and this is where they separated from St. Gregory Palamas and from the Greek fathers, and really from Orthodoxy. Okay? They have a hard time explaining why the universals are not created or eternal archetypes with an existence separate from the individual created instances and from God. And some kind of world of form, some kind of Platonism. Or if they accept the archetypes are uncreated, which they don't, polytheism. Okay? Or if the universals really do belong in the mind of God, and God is pure essence, okay, with no energy, okay, or his essence energy is identified, it's the same thing. Then therefore, the universals are just notions in our minds. There's all distinctions within the divine essence are notional, not real. And this is the problem with all of Latin theology. That because they regard God as simple essence, with no distinction in the essence of the energies, that everything in God is the same as everything else. They can't make real distinctions within God. Okay? So actually they can't, it's a fatal flaw in their Trinitarian theology. They can't really believe in the persons of the Holy Trinity. Okay? That's a whole class or a series of classes for another day, about the problems with their theology. Okay? But I'm going into this because this problem of nominalism lays the groundwork for all the subsequent development of philosophy and science in the West, where we get our science from, right, from Western Europe. Okay. So, nominalism. Why is nominalism such a big problem? Why were the Holy Fathers and the Scholastics against nominalism? Okay. We'll see how the skepticism. This is at the end of our notes from 14 last week. We'll see how the skepticism, remember skepticism means, I can't know anything. I doubt everything, right? We'll see how the skepticism engendered by nominalism, okay, if things are just names, can't really know the natures of things, they're just names, well, I'm skeptical. Well, then I guess we have to doubt everything, right? So the skepticism engendered by nominalism will infect every aspect of religion, philosophy, and politics and culture in the Renaissance, which we're about to study, and the succeeding ages. If you cannot know the natures of things as they really are, then real knowledge is impossible, and the pursuit of science is not to conform the mind to reality, and then the moral task of submitting the passions and the body to the mind. Because remember, for the ancients, for the medievals, for the good pagans, as well as our Christian fathers, the first or the primary role of science is knowledge of the truth, and it's a moral effort. It's primarily a moral effort to know the truth and conform your mind to truth, and then subject your body to the mind, right? To be a true human being, much less a Christian, right? And then secondarily, science is used as a foundation for technology to make our lives easier so people don't get discouraged, to help our brother, and so forth. But primarily, it's to know truth. Okay? But this gets inverted in the Renaissance, as we're going to see with some really strange characters in the Renaissance. In this upside-down version, real knowledge is impossible, and the pursuit of science is not to conform the mind to reality and the passions to the mind, but to conform reality to the demands of my will, dominated by the passions. It's that because I say so. You see? This satanic inversion is the basis of modern culture. It's a basis of pursuits, human pursuits, or science, technology, scholarship, and so forth. It's a sobering thought that should really motivate us to stay out of the mainstream, off the radar screen, to stay close to the church. Realize that our present state of civilization is a result of hundreds of years of science and scholarship being gradually perverted. And perversion means, right, a thorough turning away from its original purpose. Okay. Of course, as we pointed out last week, to really do science, you can't really be a nominalist. You have to believe that you can know natures. Otherwise, science is impossible. But to be politically correct, if you're in the academic world or in the scientific world, you have to say you believe in nominalism, that you can't know natures, right? Because if you say you know natures, then there's such thing as human nature. Well, then you have to conform to it. You see? There's such things as different kinds of things. So evolution really can't be true. There's no continuum. Things are distinct. Things have distinct natures. You see? And that's actually the basis of science. Okay? Which involves knowing the natures of things. Okay? But if they kind of know that in the back of their minds, but then to be politically correct, you have to say, oh, but you know, you can be whatever you want. There can be an infinite number of explanations for any phenomenon, that's the whole basis of postmodern thought, which kids are being now taught in the universities. Okay, and now Richard Weaver, our old friend from our class several years ago, he identifies this nominalism as the beginning of this whole unraveling of Western thought and the whole project of philosophy and science. So, because our science has been so devoted to acquiring the ability to manipulate material phenomena, our civilization's built an amazing material culture with a technology that's never been seen before, unless you believe in those theories about Atlantis and stuff like that. Okay. Which, even if Atlantis didn't exist, it certainly is an image or a parable of what happens when you become too proud. Right. When you try to dominate nature through magic. So we're going to see in the Renaissance now, we're going to see how modern science, the founders of modern science, many of them are closely allied with the practice of magic. Because what they were really interested in was the manipulation of nature. Alchemy, for example. How can we make gold out of base metal? Which is, think of what incident in the gospel is that like, to make gold out of base metal? What temptation, where Satan says to Christ, make bread out of stones. Mm-hmm. You see? Yeah. Where it's, be Promethean. Mm-hmm. Go against the will of God and try to deconstruct God's nature. The nature that God created, not the divine nature, but the nature that God created. Deconstruct this creation that God made for your own, to feed yourself, right? Not for some holy reason, but just for your own passions. Of course, Christ didn't have passions, but Satan didn't quite grasp that. Okay. So let's go on. Now that I've made those two corrections, let's go on to page 2 of our notes of class 15, overview of the Renaissance. Okay. The transition from the Middle Ages. Remember, I'm using this terminology that I introduced several weeks ago that was coined by a man named Peter Sorokin. And to briefly go through, now and then I have to circle back and restate concepts that we've introduced to make sure everybody's on the same page. Sorokin identifies 3 types of cultures: ideational, idealistic, and sensate. In an ideational culture, what's real is the eternal world. What's real is God. What's real is the invisible realities that God created in the spiritual universe, the angels, the saints who are in heaven. Okay, the next world, the eternal reality, that is the really real. And then a culture that is ideational is based, all its forms, whether art, architecture, science, education, everything, and of course the worship in the religion, everything is oriented to mediating that eternal reality to us so we can directly experience it. We don't, not, by directly I mean, of course, mysteriologically or sacramentally, or symbolically, but an actual mediation of that eternal world to ourselves. So in ideational culture, what's important is the spiritual, and all the forms of the culture, all the activities, the material manifestations and so forth are transparent. They're geared to simplicity and transparency, because their purpose is not to draw attention to themselves. Their purpose is not to draw that eternal reality into this world and solidify it, to encase it so you can hold it, right, or admire it. The point is for us to go in that direction, for it to mediate itself towards us and draw us upwards. So all art, all education, all science, all activities in an ideational culture are anagogical. Anagogy means leading up. They lead people up. They don't bring God down. They lead us up. God did, and we know in reality our Lord did come down, but he came down to bring us up. Right? That's the ideational culture. The opposite of ideational culture is a sensate culture. A sensate culture is a culture where everything's focused on the material, on the here and now, on the body instead of the soul, right? On matter instead of the mind, on phenomena instead of natures, instead of universal realities. And in a sensate culture, there's often a very high achievement of material art, or material architecture, or material science, and so forth, but it gradually becomes more and more fragmented and more chaotic, right? Because it's not based on any eternal principles, just a constant flight into the material world. Now, obviously, the Orthodox culture, Orthodox civilization, is ideational, and what we call modern culture or modern civilization is sensate. But there is a short period called an idealistic period that is a transition from ideational to a sensate culture. And that we see this in the 12th and 13th centuries in the high Middle Ages in the Latin West. That's why we spent several classes on this, because it was a key period when they still believed in the eternal realities, right? But their whole effort, both in theology and philosophy and art and architecture, was to bring them down and encase them in this world and admire them and be inspired by them. But their forms, the dialectical theology in the scholastic theology, the art, the architecture, the way they structured the church became this rigid, gigantic, powerful institution, right, in this world. Okay. All what this is, just being opaque, they became things in themselves. Now they're magnificent, the Gothic cathedral, the organization of the papacy, and so forth. These are magnificent things, right? And they're done originally for a religious purpose, to inspire people. But they've already become something of this world, even though they have very high ideals, and that may be very high achievement artistically or theologically or intellectually and so forth. It's still something of this world, and it couldn't last. Right? It was teetering between the old and the new, between this ideational and the sensate, and it naturally just fell over into the sensate. Why? Because they were separated from the church, because of heresy, and because of the loss of the understanding of true spiritual life. And we talked about that too in our section several weeks ago on Francis of Assisi and so forth. So that they came out of touch with the true sources of spiritual life. They entered into, instead of traditional theology based on the Holy Fathers, they entered into a dialectical theology with overemphasis on the use of reason. And so they descended from the ideational, from the truly orthodox or spiritual culture, to sort of a mixed spiritual and material culture. And finally, with the Renaissance, they fall into just pure sensate culture. So our last class, and now we're down the notes here, halfway down the page, on the second page of the notes. Our last class linked the High Middle Ages to the Renaissance by one, examining 3 mistakes of Latin theology that made the Western Church vulnerable to secular modes of thought and life. You can go back and look at that in your notes or listen to the podcast from last week. And 2, examining the philosophical error of nominalism, which we just reviewed, which changes man's entire intellectual purpose from conforming his mind to the truth of the noble natures of things, and changes that purpose from knowing the truth to creating truth, creating multiple truths with his mind, wandering in endless examinations and kaleidoscopically changing explanations of the practically infinite variety of individual phenomena. That's why kids now go through university and they come out not knowing anything. Because every day there's a new theory. Every day there's a new book out explaining a new theory of something or other. Right? It's really insane now. It wasn't insane 500 years ago. It was just wrong. Okay? But now it's gradually degenerated now to the point today where it's just insane. Where the efforts of science, of scholarship, and so forth they've become almost impossible. Right? To really get at what people can agree on as being truth. Okay. The transition from the Orthodox period to the High Medieval period marked a lowering from the ideational culture that we just explained, dominated by the spiritual life, to an idealistic culture dominated by the intellectual or psychic life. And last week we talked about this. Right? The Latins made the confusion between the nous and the diania, the spiritual mind and the regular mind, or they made the confusion between the spirit and soul. They just thought it was all the same. So the high medieval Latins go from the spiritual life to the intellectual psychic life. They also went not only in their teaching, but actually in reality, because they lost grace. They were outside the church. Right? And the transition from the High Middle Ages to the Renaissance marked a lowering from an idealistic culture dominated by the intellectual life to a sensate culture dominated by the carnal and material. Now, in the sensate culture, they're very smart people. They're using their brains, right? They're using their minds to do a lot of amazing things. But their focus is on the carnal. Their focus is on the material, a material conception of life. Okay. Thus, this movement can be summarized as a downward movement from spirit to soul, body. Okay. Now, this apostasy of the West recapitulates what happened to our first parents in paradise. Okay? So our first parents in paradise, their nous, their pneuma, their spirit, their spiritual intellect was directly in communion with God. And the soul, the psyche fed on the divine energies mediated through the spirit, through the nous. And their body fed on psychic energy that was fed by the divine energies. And the earth, they left alone. They didn't have to manipulate the earth, use the earth. They were just tending it, keeping it. They were eating little tiny vegetables or something. They hardly needed, all they needed was the fruit from the tree of life. Right? Okay. They were the original ascetics. But it was asceticism without pain, because their minds are directly in communion with the divine, and they were going to live forever. They were going to be immortal. And know God more and more and more for all eternity. And then when their will, when they perverted or they destroyed their natural will and used their gnomic will, which is the gnomic will is the will according to opinion. That's not in accord with God's will, but God just lets you, okay, you want to have that opinion, go ahead. Right? But it's not your true will. It actually doesn't, it's not actually freedom, it actually enslaves you. Okay? They used their gnomic will to turn away from the will of God. They broke the connection of their nous to the divine. Okay? The nous closed up. The psyche is not getting the divine energies anymore. It starts feeding on the body, the sensations of the body. And the body has to feed on the earth. What does God say to Adam? Now you're going to go out there and you're going to draw your bread from the ground by the sweat of your brow. Okay. So what happens with the saints, what happens in Orthodoxy and with our saints, is that they reverse this. They receive the grace. We all receive that grace in baptism. We receive the grace in Holy Communion. But the saints are the ones who really totally use it, right? They go all the way with it. And they restore that connection of their spiritual intellect to God, and the psyche is ruled then by the spirit, and the body is ruled by the psyche. And the body can be very abstemious. It doesn't manipulate. It doesn't rape the earth. It doesn't steal things. It doesn't use up things. Right? It's very, very abstemious, very, very ascetical. Okay. So the saints reverse this fall. But what happens? We see on a huge civilizational level how the West recapitulated the fall of Adam. Right? When they turned away from orthodoxy to scholasticism in the High Middle Ages, they left the realm of the nous, they went to the realm of the psyche. And then when they went to the Renaissance, they left the realm of the psyche and just went to the realm of the body. Again, they had good minds. These are smart, a lot of really amazingly smart people. But they're all focused on this world, on material things. Okay? And this second fall was bound to occur because once man separates his mind from grace and from authentic spiritual experience, he cannot maintain the superiority of mind, of his soul, over his body, no matter how hard he tries. Okay. Now, the ostensible cause, what they say was the cause of the Renaissance, was the so-called rediscovery of classical literature and the rebirth. That's what Renaissance means. It's French, from naissance, rebirth, right, of classical culture. But actually, these new humanists, who are actually heretical Christians, right, they're not old pagans who never heard of Christ. They're not Plato and Aristotle. They're people whose ancestors have been Christians for 1,000 years or more. And they are trying to invent a new Christianity. And they're mining the classical culture to give them ammunition in a revolt against a view of the world that was already perfected in the church. Okay? So it was not some glorious return to some higher thing. It was a fall to something lower. If we look back to antiquity, the great minds of antiquity leading up to the birth of Christ, they were looking forward to a revelation from the true God to answer their unanswered questions. Plato, Aristotle, they all knew they had unanswered questions. They knew they were waiting for God to reveal the truth to them. Okay? To give men the higher wisdom, which can only come from God. And God gave them the answer. Christ, the incarnate wisdom of God. Hagia Sophia, the holy wisdom. By going back and reinventing the wheel, returning to a so-called quest that the pre-Christian thinkers had, the Renaissance humanists are not gaining wisdom, they're losing wisdom. Right? They're confusing their minds. Now, they did amazing technical work in restoring old manuscripts, and Erasmus did amazing work in Greek philology and so forth. There's nothing I say is to take away the brilliance of their intellectual achievements. You'd have to be a barbarian, be a caveman, right? To look at it and say, well, that's stupid, or that's useless, or we're not interested in that. It's some of their achievements in and of themselves are amazing simply as achievements. But they're off on the wrong track. It's like they're doing amazing things, but for very stupid reasons. You see? And they're forgetting, in their quest for worldly wisdom, they're forgetting the spiritual wisdom. So actually they're not, even though they're creating fragmented they're creating achievements that stand by themselves. It's kind of a fragment of something wonderful. Their whole worldview is being shattered constantly. Right? Greater and greater fragmentation, greater and greater division, greater and greater instability in the mind and in the culture. Okay, so what happens is something I call the bifurcation of European life. Bifurcation means breaking into two parts. The same thing has two sides to it, two parts to it. When we say the Renaissance culture is neo-pagan, humanistic, man-centered, secular, carnal, and so forth, that's not to say the church or Christianity just disappeared. Of course, Orthodox Christianity wasn't there. It was what we call now today Roman Catholic or Protestant Christianity. But the church just didn't, at least the outward appearance of the church just didn't disappear, of course. Some form of the outward historical institutional church remains a dominant or the dominant influence in all the Western European nations. Right? The church, the Western church wasn't chased out of public life really until our own era. Okay. It remains an enormous influence, something enormously important in Western Europe. Okay. Even after the Protestant revolt against Rome, the papal church remains the central institution in the papal countries, and some kind of national church remains in the Protestant countries. To this day, even though nobody goes to church, there's a national church in Germany, right? A Lutheran church in the Lutheran sections of Germany, the Catholic church in the Catholic parts, or an official Lutheran church in Scandinavia. Okay, the Church of England, which is a classic, like the archetypal example of the state church that nobody believes in, right? So everyone in these countries regards himself as a Christian. Some of the thinkers we're going to study, they're writing really horrible things, and they're doing it, they believe in the service of Christianity, or their version of Christianity, right? Including the leading thinkers, the artists, the politicians, the businessmen. But at the same time, they're making enormous changes in the philosophy, the science, the politics, economics, the art. And these changes create a sensate culture that's Christian in name, but it's worldly in its content. It's a carnal Christianity. Okay. Now the elites who set the pace for the rest of their national populations, they're rushing headlong to all kinds of experimentation, innovation. And this comes into dynamic conflict often with church authority and with the simple people. That's why the Western Church developed the Inquisition. Okay? The Inquisition just weren't a bunch of mean, creepy monks going around torturing innocent people. They were actually worried. The church authorities were worried about all these crazy new streams of thought that they couldn't control at all. There were so many new ideas going out there, and some of them were obviously heretical. Okay. Eventually, the innovations went out. Why? Because the simpler believing people, they're simple. Eventually, the simple people follow the leaders. The simple people can hold out for a while, but eventually they follow the elites. Okay? So remember, as I said last week, when we're talking about these cultural changes, originally we're talking about the elites. We're talking about the nobility, the intellectuals, the clergy, the artists, and so forth, who are setting the pace for the culture. And these innovations went out because there's no longer the anchor of the true faith, orthodoxy, and there's no longer any unity of an integrated culture. Right? Because in a sensate culture, there's always increasing fragmentation and instability, right? Because they're getting away from the center of things. They're getting away from God. He's the foundation. He's the center. But they're eager to create. They're eager to innovate. They're eager to find new answers, new forms. They keep getting farther and farther apart from each other, right? The culture becomes more and more fragmented as there are more experiments in creativity, right? So with the Renaissance, Europe starts to lead a double life. Okay, the outward institutions are still officially Christian. Beautiful, big churches, orphanages, schools, amazing. The Western Church in the past 500 years has an amazing track record of outward achievement. The number of buildings, the number of people they've fed, the number of hospitals they've built. You have to hand it to them. Okay, it's an amazing achievement. Okay, but the inner life was increasingly humanistic. It's increasingly pagan in its content, which is why in the revolutionary period it just fell apart, just kind of fell to the ground. Okay. And especially it was lived by the elites. So the elites, a lot of the nobility, a lot of the clergy, a lot of the intellectuals, the artists, in their public life they are Christians. In their private life they're doing all kinds of things, right? Occult religion, really immoral lifestyles, or just all kinds of, and are just writing philosophy or writing things about science that are clearly at odds with the church, okay? Even though they're officially Christian. Okay. So there's the old elites, the nobility and the clergy, and then there's the new elites, the intellectuals, the artists, and the merchant class. And the merchants become part of the elites on the basis of that they have wealth, they have financial power. Okay. So the tensions created by this double identity. Remember, you can't, if you're a schizophrenic, right? If you're living a double life, you can't keep that up forever, right? At some point, something's going to give way. You're going to collapse. Okay. So the tensions created by this double identity cannot be endured, and they give way to the open revolution against the Christian order. It starts in 1789. Now, a classic example of how this happened quickly in the Orthodox world was in Russia. Russia started to live a double life at the time of Peter the Great on. In the 19th century, the conservative and pious czars put the brakes on it, but the elites had already been corrupted. Right? The aristocracy and the intelligentsia in Russia were corrupted. And Russia was leading a double life. Okay? And then in the Balkan nations, to the extent there was Western influence, as the Balkan nations came into existence, modern Romania, modern Greece, modern Bulgaria, and so forth, there was so much influence from the West that they started leading a double life. Right? There was the old Orthodox life, then there was the Western influence. Okay, we're going to study that later on when we get to the 18th and 19th centuries, as we're going to the Orthodox countries. But now the Western countries went through this 500 years before during the Renaissance period. Okay. So we're going to organize our discussion of the Renaissance around the themes we find in the notes from Father Seraphim's lectures. He talks about this theme of fame, superstition. He talks about the Protestant Reformation and also Chiliasm, which I'm going to include at the Protestant Reformation. Science, including, he has a section on the Copernican Revolution, which is an aspect of science, and art, as well as some further topics I think we should go into to round it out, which are politics and economics. Let's talk about these three topics tonight: fame, the cult of the individual, superstition, and the Protestant Reformation. So you know that in our Orthodox culture and in the Western Church, during its Orthodox period, the artist, whether it's an iconographer or hymnographer or whatever, is almost anonymous, or is anonymous. Right? The community is creating the culture. The community is worshiping God. Because the gospel is the law of the culture. The gospel is the law for the community. The individual acts in humility. He's not seeking fame. He's seeking to serve God, to serve his neighbor. Okay? You're not. Who do we glorify? We glorify the saints, not artists or football players or movie stars or whatever. We glorify the saints. And who are the saints? Saints, people who specifically did not seek glory for themselves. They sought not to be known. They sought to be humbled, even to be hated. Okay. Now the Renaissance flips this around, and they start glorifying the people who seek glory. They glorify the ones who openly say, "I want glory." This starts preeminently in Italy. Okay. We have to understand the Renaissance. You have to understand that so much of the Renaissance culture is created in the city-states of northern Italy. Florence being the preeminent example. Okay, Venice is a little different. Venice is one of them, but Venice still has the echoes of Byzantium. They're still more in touch with the old culture. But places like Florence, preeminently, Padua, Siena, these are places where this whole new conception of life is being created and glorified. And it's really appropriate that Florence is taking the lead in all this, because Florence is the hometown, well, sort of the hometown of our old friend Francis of Assisi. Actually, Francis originally, I believe, was from Perugia, which is outside of Florence. Perugia was actually older than Florence. Florence was originally the Roman army camp outside of Perugia, but Florence became the big town in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. So we have now in these Italian city-states, you have all these people seeking fame. I want to be a famous poet. I want to be a famous military leader. I want to be a famous politician. I want my family to dominate and be famous, like the Medicis and the Borgias and so forth. Okay. So this is the age when the center of man's attention shifted from God to man. That's why we call it the age of humanism. Humanism. Man is the measure of all things. The motto of the Renaissance. Man is the measure of all things. Okay. Now what this meant in real life, as it plays out in real life, what this means is that the ego becomes the center of everything. Right? A great man becomes great through achieving fame. Father Seraphim quotes at length from a 19th century book on the Renaissance by Jacob Burckhardt. If you have your Father Seraphim's notes, look on the second page of Lecture 3, and he gives these quotes from Jacob Burckhardt, who was a 19th century scholar who actually wrote a very complete and honest book about the Renaissance. The author, that should be author, not authors. The author Burckhardt dedicates a chapter to the subject of the modern idea of fame, which first arises in the Renaissance. Even Dante, we mentioned Dante recently. He's thought of as the preeminent Christian poet, right? The poet of the great Divine Comedy, right? But Burckhardt says he strove for the poet's garland, the crown of the poet, right? With all the power of his soul. As a publicist and man of letters, he laid stress on the fact that what he did was new. And that's a key thing. I'm doing something totally new. Nobody's ever done this before. I'm doing it better. I'm doing it better than anybody's ever done this before. And that he wished not only to be the first in his pursuits, but to be esteemed as the first. I not only want to be the first poet, I want to be esteemed as the first poet. I want that glory. Mm-hmm. Okay. Father Seraphim also quotes Burckhardt referring to another poet named Musatus, who was crowned poet at Padua by the bishop. Okay, so here's how they're mixing Christianity with paganism, right? They're glorifying this egotistical individual for his artistic achievement. So they actually had a ceremony where the bishop crowned him as the crowned poet of Padua. And he was venerated with a solemn procession on Christmas. On Christmas, the students and the clergy would go with torches to his house and sing hymns to him as a great poet. See? Very, very, very worldly. Okay? Now think about this. This is just idolatry. Right? And it's obviously a precursor of the idolization of celebrities in our own time. Right? It's not as crass as Lady Gaga or NFL football or something. It's much more much more refined than that. But it's still essentially it's the same thing. So instead of the saints, they're glorifying these people, creating this beautiful, sensual poetry. Okay. And it doesn't apply. He mentions the examples of poets, but it's in all walks of life. They're soldiers or whatever they are. Now, this Burckhardt, who was an agnostic, Father Seraphim says, this agnostic even says there's something demonic about all this. It's funny how these agnostics, off their old Christian instincts, come out and they say, there's something demonic. This has got to be demonic. Demonic about this lust for fame that we see in the political rivals of the time. And you could spend your whole life just studying the political intrigues of these families in these Italian cities, right? They'll do anything to make a name for themselves. They'll even murder somebody to make a name for themselves because they're consumed by their passions. Does that remind you, murdering somebody to make a name for yourself, does that remind you of a character in Dostoevsky? Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. He wants to prove that he's above the ordinary run of men because he'll just murder somebody just because he feels like it. And they'll prove that he's somebody important, right? That he's a Superman. Okay, and Machiavelli. Actually, Burckhardt is reading he's quoting Machiavelli. Even Machiavelli is saying with horror. Even Machiavelli, the father of pragmatic politics, he's saying with horror, how could these people just murder somebody just to murder somebody? Okay. There have always been ambitious men who will commit sins to gain power. I mean, that's throughout human history, right? But in the Renaissance, it's a dominant theme, and it's praised, right? It's regarded as a value. These people are famous. They're put on pedestals. Okay. This self-centeredness affects philosophy as well. Okay, so this behavior affects the way they think about themselves, and eventually, at the end of the Renaissance, it's going to produce someone right after the age of the Renaissance who becomes the father of modern philosophy, and that's René Descartes. Of course, he's not Italian; he's French, and actually spent a lot of his life in the Netherlands. Descartes comes at the end of this period. He's in the first half of the 17th century, the early 1600s. But how does Descartes create his new philosophy? He said, I put aside all tradition. I put aside all the teachings of the church, of the fathers, of the Plato, Aristotle, everything. It's a blank slate. My first principle is, I think, therefore I am.
Cogito ergo sum.
Cogito ergo sum. Right. That's Cartesianism, the basis of Cartesianism. Right. Now, of course, Descartes was a brilliant mathematician. His mathematical findings and theorems are correct. They're all valid. I'm not saying that as a mathematician he was wrong. Right. As a philosopher, he's giving a radically individualistic or self-centered basis for philosophy. And people rightly call him the father of modern philosophy. All modern philosophical schools end up going back to Descartes. Okay. So it's a further repudiation of tradition. So he's basically making a philosophy out of nowhere, right? Just out of his own mind. Okay. And he even says, what I'm going to do, Descartes at one point says, what I'm going to do is better than anything anyone's ever done. I'm the greatest. But what's curious, and we'll see this throughout this journey, through this period and afterwards, is that even though they claim that they're humanists, and they claim that it's all out of their own minds, Many of these people claim also to have had mystical visions. Where are those mystical visions coming from? Yes, exactly. Descartes had 3 dreams, a series of 3 dreams. I think he was in the Netherlands in the Dutch army, or at one of his sojourns in life. He went around doing different things, like a lot of these people. He had 3 dreams that revealed these truths to him, you see. So basically he's claiming to be, and this is something that you don't read in the ordinary books about Descartes, right? They just say, quid ergo sum, here's his mathematics, blah, blah, blah. They don't talk about, but if you read serious biographies of these people, you find out that many of them had these preternatural experiences. They had mystical visions. Well, you could see this if you really study the spread of Copernican cosmology. A key figure was Kepler, who claimed to be taken by spirits to the moon. You don't read about that. If you study the history of astronomy, you don't read about Kepler's mystical visions. But Kepler based a lot of his so-called findings on the demonic experiences where he claimed he went to the moon. And his mother was a witch. And there's a theory that he murdered his teacher, Tycho Brahe, who believed in geocentrism. But that's a question for another day when we get to Copernicus. My point is that a lot of these people, they claim to be humanists. They claim that it's all reason. They claim that it's all it's not based on any kind of divinity or any kind of prayer. It's all out of it's all reason. It's all rational. Okay? But amazingly, a great deal of the time, they're having these visions, dreams, and they claim intuitions from God or from the good angels, but we know probably where a lot of these things came from. Okay. So that leads us on to this second topic of superstition. The Renaissance is not some great age of reason after the darkness of the age of faith. Right? The Middle Ages, so-called, were the age of faith and reason, because the two go together. Right? Faith is the basis of reason, because without faith, without revelation, there's no way to prove that mind exists, okay, or that natures exist, right? Okay. The Renaissance marks a tremendous turn to occultism, magic, astrology, alchemy, and superstition. All that stuff's going on. Okay. This is the age of Nostradamus. You've heard of Nostradamus, right? The so-called prophet who based all these incredible predictions on the stars, right? He's reading of the stars. Paracelsus, the alchemist. Remember, alchemy is magical science, right? The quest for turning base metal into gold. The eclecticism of Pico della Mirandola. Eclecticism means gathering all kinds of things and putting them together in one. It's from the Greek word to collect. Okay, it's a collection. Collectionism. Pico della Mirandola, and this is an interesting character that deserves in the sense of that we need to study. You'd have to study him a lot to really understand the spirit of the Renaissance. And it's not, what you study, it's not pretty. Okay? He wants to combine Christianity, Kabbalah, which is medieval Jewish occultism, right? Platonism, and a whole host of contrary ideas and systems, including magic, into some kind of universal religion. It's a time of anything goes. They're all over the place. Okay? They're trying all kinds of things. Now, part of that bifurcation I mentioned, that double life they were leading, it involves the popes. A lot of the popes of this period were leading this double life. A lot of them believed in astrology. Okay? Burckhardt, who was quoted by Father Seraphim, states that Julius II, who was one of the very worst, Julius II said the poster child for a really bad pope, he had the day for his coronation set by astrologers. When he consulted the astrologers, when are the stars going to line up, right? So the best day for my coronation. Leo X thought the flourishing state of astrology in his time to be a credit. He bragged about, we have a lot of good astrologers. My period as Pope, I've really encouraged astrology. It's a feather in my cap. Okay? Paul III never held a consistory, a cardinals meeting, without consulting the astrologers. So there's a great deal of neo-paganism and occult practice going on behind the scenes, or not so much behind the scenes, among the highest church officials. And a great deal more could be said about this. There's a new book out by a man named Michael Hoffman called The Occult Renaissance Church of Rome. Michael Halpin's a Roman Catholic, and he wrote this book, and it details more than you want to read about all this. And by the way, it's interesting, when I was studying it this week we're in the first week of Great Lent, and this service we did tonight, Great Compline and the Great Canon, it's the exact opposite of all these terrible things we're talking about. And as I was preparing the other classes earlier this year, before Lent, it didn't bother me that much. I was reading about these terrible things. But this first week of Great Lent, and it was really, to go back and read this stuff is really disgusting. It's just so disgusting. And you realize that orthodoxy really is the truth. And these things are really a violation of our souls. But the reason we're studying them is because these movements, these ideas, these developments have really laid the foundation for the world that we live in. Okay. So now let's talk about the Protestant Reformation. So this is when the Luther and Calvin and all those people revolt against the Pope and create their own churches. Right. Well, the Protestant Reformers claimed they want to go back to the Bible. They want to create a purified Christianity, but they themselves couldn't escape the age they lived in. They were typical of their age. They too stress individualism, right? Glorifying the individual. Okay? Every believer has his own Bible, and of course there's the invention of the printing press, which for the first time in history could put cheap books in the hands of everybody. So all these people had their Bibles. They were deciding for themselves what the Bible meant. Okay? This leads to the Protestant movement splitting into innumerable sects, and the unity of Christian Europe is shattered into all these warring states and many wars, often religious wars. Right? So again we see the characteristic traits of modernity: innovation, fragmentation, instability. Okay. Now the Protestants claim to be reacting against the humanism of the Renaissance. Right? They said, we don't want to read all that Plato and Aristotle and all that stuff. We just want the Bible. Right? We're returning to a God-centered faith based on the Word of God, but actually their whole spirit was and it remains very humanistic. It's a very humanistic spirit. Father Seraphim rightly points out that both humanism and Protestantism continue the work of scholasticism and Francis of Assisi, that is, the search to improve on orthodoxy, improve on Christianity, a new Christianity, right? We have to improve on what's been handed down to us. They're continuing the work of Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor. That's a reference. Father Seraphim is referring to that famous chapter in Brothers Karamazov, where Ivan, the middle brother, has a dream or a vision or an idea of Christ coming to earth, and the Grand Inquisitor is saying, listen, we've improved on Christianity. We have to burn you as a heretic because you're going to make trouble, because this religion you brought to earth, it's too hard. We've made a cool, brand new religion for people. Okay. So both humanism and Protestantism are stages in the destruction of the Christian worldview. Later on, there are more advanced stages. That's the end of the quote from Father Seraphim. Now, Father Seraphim's notes go on at great length about some of the strangest manifestations of Protestantism, which are the chiliastic kingdoms set up by Antichrist Messiah types, who claim to be setting up the kingdom of God on earth. You can go back and it goes on and on about Leiden and Münster and different places where these sects created these totalitarian societies where they basically murdered or burned everybody that didn't go along with them. He rightly sees this. Father Seraphim spends a lot of time on chiliasm. Remember, he talks a lot about it in the Middle Ages too. Okay? Because he's very concerned about it, for he sees this as a key element of the spirit of our times, creating heaven on earth. Right? Our own time created the Soviet paradise, or the 1,000-year Reich, and so forth. Okay? And the Soviet thing and the Nazi thing, those are just preludes to something more horrible that's being formed. Right? The world government of the Antichrist. Now the Counter-Reformation is when the Roman Church reacts to the Reformation by trying to clean their own house. They recognized there's a lot of corruption. There were some better popes, and they tightened discipline. They stopped the worst abuses and the sales of indulgences and phony relics and so forth. And they had this council, the Council of Trent. Trent's a city in northern Italy, which lasted for 8 years, 1545, 1563. Oh, that's 18 years. They spent 18 years laying the groundwork of what came to be known as the Tridentine Church. When you hear the term Tridentine or Tridentine, that means the Council of Trent. Their whole period from the Council of Trent to this Vatican II council they had in the 60s. Okay. But even this, what's interesting is that even this Council of Trent was right over Pope Paul III, the one who consulted astrologers. So I wonder how many times he consulted the astrologers before they called a session of the Council of Trent. Now, this period of the Papal Church, the period of these 400 years from the Trent until Vatican II, it's marked by the extreme centralization of power. It marks the zenith, the very top achievement of the efficiency of church organization, which had always been a strong point of the Roman Church, the papacy. But in this modern period, they just reached this super. It was just an amazing, well-oiled machine, and a worldwide machine. Okay. But of course, the problem is there was no return to orthodoxy. But they actually hardened their papal. They became even more fanatic about their papal ideology in reaction to Protestantism. So you have the Protestants scattering every which way into every heresy imaginable and creating any kind of sect you can even imagine. Then you had the papacy just hardening themselves in this worship of the Pope and this absolutism of the Pope. Okay? So nothing's getting better. Right? They're just going farther and farther away from orthodoxy. Right? So in our next class, we're going to discuss the science and art in this period. Okay. We're going to hold our next class 2 weeks from now. I've decided that during Lent, it's going to be difficult to keep up every week. And we'll have 2 more classes during Lent, during the 3rd and 5th week of Lent, and then we'll resume after Pascha.
Father, is it fair to say that Counter-Reformation actually saved the Catholic Church for 400 more years, or?
Yes, the Counter-Reformation was.
I'm doing this with Theodore now.
Sure.
We just revised the chapter today.
No, the Counter-Reformation was an amazing achievement.
He actually, with the Jesuits basically, because I think probably they were in the center of this.
Well, the Jesuits were the shock troops of. Actually, several of the orders were kind of the shock troops of debating with the Protestants and winning populations back from the Protestants. The Trinitarians were very involved. The Dominicans were very involved in these efforts. They developed the Counter-Reformation had enormous outward achievements. One is our system of education.
Exactly.
They developed a worldwide network. You could go. Not long ago, even in my lifetime. I lived at the tail end of this when I was a teenager, as a college student. It was after Vatican II, but still all the power and the efficiency of the old institutions were still in place. You can go to a seminary in Rome, and you go to one in China, or the Philippines, or Australia, and it was all exactly the same. Everybody could speak Latin. Well, I didn't actually. I lived after that period, but there was the men who taught me. Everybody spoke Latin, the Mass is exactly the same, the classes were exactly the same. And this is a billion people of the face of the earth. Okay? And this is, of course, the sheer mass or size of it was only achieved in the 19th and 20th centuries. But the structures, the efficiency, the organization, and the zeal was put in place here at the Council of Trent. And it really, they almost destroyed orthodoxy in several places. Or they did. They were so efficient, they were so smart, they were so organized, and they were so wealthy, they come into the Ukraine or Syria or somewhere and just say, look, join us. The Orthodox are disorganized, they're poor, they don't have schools. The priests, look, those priests, your village priest can't debate with me. I'm so smart, I can turn him upside down, inside out.
But initially they said the Catholics were poor debaters compared to Protestants.
Yes,
they were losing people because the Protestants were so
smart. because the Catholics had orders like the Dominicans who'd been debating heretics since the 13th century, right? But the typical village priest in the West was like a village priest in Orthodox countries, a relatively simple person. And the Protestants would come in and start debating, and the priest couldn't. The priest he knew his tradition, he knew his prayer book, he knew the Mass, he knew the services, he knew the lives of the saints, but he couldn't debate all this intellectual theology.
Yeah.
So they went into high gear, and that's why Ignatius Loyola had this experience where he decided to devote his life to basically fighting Protestantism. That's the origin of the Jesuits.
Mhm.
And the Dominicans had already been organized in the 13th century to combat heretics, right? So the Dominicans went into high gear, and they did. They prevented the spread of Protestantism to such an extent that the countries around the Mediterranean, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Italy, and also France. Although France was kind of always hard for the Pope to manage because the French were proud; they had minds of their own, but they remained Catholic. The French, though, were a near thing. The Huguenots, the Calvinists in France, could conceivably have overturned Catholic rule in France, but it didn't happen. But no, there's no doubt that the Counter-Reformation, taken all in all, was an enormous achievement.
Well, I was shocked when I read that they went back. I said, listen, we have to go back to, we venerate the saints, we like how at least how the church was, like they were, because the Protestants were questioning all of this.
The Protestants were iconoclasts. Yes. They were destroying everything.
You don't have icons. You don't go.
No priesthood. No sacraments.
No sacrament. Nothing.
Nothing. Right.
And the Counter-Reformation said, no. The truth is, we have to go back to this.
Yes.
Actually, this is when they started the seminaries for the priests, like the.
Exactly. This is when the seminary system was created. Because as I said, in the previously, their priests, which like many Orthodox priests were until recently, which are just the man in the village who could read and who was pious, and they made him the priest. And then they started requiring higher education because it's the age of the printing press, it's the age of modern science. The Protestants have their intellectual achievement, right, and they're debaters and so forth. So we have to do the same. We have the same thing. And then, but see, then the Orthodox face the same problem with the Uniates, with Uniatism. So the Jesuits come into the Ukraine or somewhere and say, well, look, your priests can't debate us. And that's when the Orthodox started having seminaries in the 17th century. So the Catholics started their seminaries in the 16th century. The Orthodox started seminaries in the 17th century, usually not to fight Protestants. In some places, the Orthodox had to deal with Protestants, but in many places, usually it was the Roman Catholics.
So if at this time the Catholics were trying to regroup, were they proud, or why didn't they go back to the Orthodoxy?
Because they believed that Orthodoxy wasn't true. They believed in the supremacy of the Pope. They believed in their old heresies, like the Filioque. They believed that their heresies were truth. They want to force the Orthodox to bow to the Pope, and they almost in the Council of Florence, which ended in 1439. That was the last time that the Orthodox showed that they might.
1,000-year history there. Can you say that everything was just bad and you have to scrap it and hold on to the Pope?
No, the Catholics were saying we've always bowed down to the Pope. It's always the way we say it is. Mm-hmm. They're saying that we're wrong about the first 1,000 years. That the way they are, that's the way it always was. Like Saint Basil the Great, he bowed. He realized he had his authority from the Pope, and so forth. Okay, but so we didn't in our course we didn't study the specific heresies of papism and the Filioque and so forth. But we can go back and talk about that. We can have a whole course actually in Roman Catholicism because.
But it always seems like within an organization there are people that listen to the other side. So maybe not all Catholics are interested in this, but I'm pretty sure there are Catholic people that still were connected to the Orthodoxy, and there was some exchange of knowledge and tradition and information.
Well, it's interesting you should say that. I read a few years ago. I read an excerpt of the biography, or the autobiography of the Abbé Guettet. Abbé Guettet was a French Roman Catholic priest, Father Vladimir Guettet. Later he's Vladimir. He was originally René Guettet. And he wrote a now famous book against the papacy. It's a great tool for when you're debating with Catholics. It's a great tool, Father Guettet's book. But he talks about his childhood, and he says, the Christianity I grew up with in my parish church was totally different from what I learned in the seminary. And he describes his life, really the life of a Christian in a village or in a parish church in Europe 500, 600 years ago in Western Europe is not outwardly not a great deal different from the life of the Orthodox people. Okay, it's centered around the services, feast days, the fasts, the parish saints' day, and devotions in the home, and so forth and so on. But at the higher levels, they developed this new theology, and so when the boys went to the seminary, they learned this whole. Again, it's this phenomenon of bifurcation. There's the old traditional instinctive church just goes right on. Then there's all these new innovations created by the elite. The problem is that the church is hierarchical. So even though there might be traditional aspects of the parish life, as time goes on, what the elites are teaching and doing keeps affecting and keeps distorting.
The top got infected, and then
The fish rots from the head down, right? So that's why, people say, well, I'm not worried about what they're doing in the seminaries because my priest is good. Yeah, but who's your next priest going to be? Say, well, I'm not worried about what the bishop is doing. I just said, because my priest. Yeah, but the bishop is your leader, right? What he's teaching is you're supposed to believe that, right? That's part of the unity of the church. So,
One last comment, because I know you're...
yeah.
In this book I'm studying with Theodore, he
Mhm.
said about counter-reformation, he said if the church, if you see the sky is or the cloud is white
Mm-hmm.
with your eyes, but the church, this is what they said, the church is telling you that it's black. It's there. I gotta
Yeah.
you must think, you must trust that the sky,
Is black.
the cloud is black.
Okay,
But also, and later they said they destroy all the councils, like church councils, like it's all papacy. They said
Yep.
the Pope cannot. So the church actually is the Pope.
the church is the Pope.
So
And you have to believe whatever, and they have the teaching of complete internal assent. Not only do you have to say you believe what the Pope teaches, and within you have to internally assent to everything the Pope teaches, or you're going to hell. Okay. And what the Pope teaches is true. I had years ago I had a young deacon in my parish in Denver, and he and his wife had converted from Catholicism, and his wife's uncle was a PhD in theology from a Catholic university, Laval, which is at least was a highly regarded traditional theology program. The man was brilliant. Her uncle had been blinded in Vietnam, and he got a PhD reading books with Braille. And she asked him, she was questioning, she said, Uncle, she said, if tomorrow the Pope said abortion is not a sin, would it not be a sin? Would that be true? And he said, not only would it be true, but it would always have been true.
wow, with always.
Always have been
So
true.
that's like 1984. That's over.
Yes, exactly.
Rewriting the history.
Yeah. It's not a good thing. Yeah.